for joining us today. So this is the 25th annual lecture series of the ZH Library and Fires. Welcome everybody in person and on Zoom. The theme of today's talk is From Scroll to Screen, Archiving Zoroastrian Manuscripts in the Digital World. This lecture series was co-sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. Django Mistry, our dear ZH Library Committee member, will first introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Daniel Sheffield, which will be followed by a short Q&A. Then lunch will be served at noon, after which Yasmin Pavri, another dear committee member of the ZH Library, will welcome Dr. Afshin Marashi for his talk, followed by a Q&A and then a joint Q&A with both Dr. Sheffield and Dr. Marashi. For those joining us on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat and we will address them during the Q&A sections of today's lectures. During the lunch break, we will close the Zoom meeting and then come back online at 1 p.m. CST using the same specific link. So, Django, please come on up. Thank you.
Just hold it like this. Okay. Good morning. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker for the morning, Dr. Daniel Sheffield. As Dr. Sheffield reminded us last night, he was here with us 10 years earlier. And at that time, too, I was the one who had introduced him. And since that time, of course, he has become much older and wiser. But I have only become older, much, much older. Anyway, Dr. Daniel Sheffield comes to us with incredible knowledge and accomplishments. A scholar, author, professor, speaker, and linguist, he is one of those people who have such a long list of qualifications that to list them would take longer than his talk. So I've tried to give you a small fraction of his accomplishments, just to give you a feel of Dr. Sheffield. To start, can you hear me properly? Okay. To start, Dan Sheffield holds a bachelor's, master's, and a doctorate degree from the prestigious Harvard University. For his PhD, his award-winning dissertation was titled In the Path of the Prophet, Narratives of the Life of Zarathustra in Islamic Iran and Western India. With his impressive academic credentials, he has held various teaching positions at Harvard, at the University of Washington, and now he's on the faculty of the Princeton University for the last 10 years as Associate Professor of Near Eastern Studies. Is that correct? Okay. He's a specialist in the history of Zoroastrianism in the medieval and early modern periods. And here's something else. In his spare time, he has learned and become fluent in Persian, Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, French, German, and Italian. And of course, add English to that. And last night he told me he also knows Avastha and Palvi. So that makes it 10 in all. I can't even count 1 to 10 in those languages. Anyway, today for the morning session, Dr. Sheffield's talk is going to be on Testimonies of Tradition and Introduction to Zoroastrian Manuscripts. Zoroastrian manuscripts come in many forms, from ancient scriptures to Granny's recipe books. Manuscripts provide an invaluable window into the histories of Zoroastrian communities around the globe. In this talk, Professor Sheffield will debunk common misconceptions about what Zoroastrian manuscripts are and why they are so precious for our global cultural heritage. After briefly surveying the history of modern manuscript collections, we will talk about cutting-edge digital and AI-based approaches, everything is AI these days, to the tens of thousands of surviving Zoroastrian manuscripts around the globe. Friends, it is not often that we come across someone who has so much knowledge on Zoroastrianism and gains so much recognition everywhere. That he has taken the time to be with us for the weekend is a real gift to our community. And for that, we are grateful and truly humbled. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the distinguished Professor Daniel Sheffield. Thank you. You don't need the mic.
No, I've got my own. Thank you so much, Junggu, for that extremely generous introduction. This one, okay. All right, we're going to do some adjustments. Okay. Thank you so much, Junggu, for that extremely generous introduction. Most of it was hyperbole and exaggeration. I can, fluency is an aspiration, not something that is truly something that I realize. Even in English, as you'll soon come to realize, I'm not a particularly compelling speaker of the English language, and I hope not to bore you and put you all to sleep today. But as I was invited by Charmine and Alban to come join my friends here in Houston again to participate in this truly wonderful event of 25 years of the Zoroastrian Library of Houston, I was trying to think what I could present that would be novel, would be something that everyone could actually enjoy and follow, and would also be productive for me as a scholar to think through, so that I could perhaps try to grapple with some of the really big picture questions in the field of Zoroastrian manuscript studies. I think it's quite often the case that when a speaker comes to speak about Zoroastrian studies, whether it's to a scholarly audience or to a community audience, they often have some sort of assumptions in mind about the field, and they often deal with extremely particular questions of linguistics, of philology, and often don't take the time to step back to think about the larger picture. So I thought what I would try to do today was to give you a talk that was originally entitled Zoroastrian Manuscripts for Dummies, which isn't to say that anyone in the audience is a dummy, but I wanted to think about what actually is a Zoroastrian manuscript. When I use this phrase, what do we have in mind? How many Zoroastrian manuscripts are there? What are the oldest Zoroastrian manuscripts? What counts as a Zoroastrian manuscript? Does a cookbook count as a Zoroastrian manuscript? I don't know. Let's find out. So I've tried to put some of these thoughts together in today's presentation, and I really look forward to your questions and comments on the presentation. There are a lot of pictures, so I apologize to everyone on this side of the room. You might have a little bit of a difficulty in seeing the text at the bottom of the screen because I'm standing in your way. So let's get started. What is a Zoroastrian manuscript? There are many different ways you could actually answer this question. For instance, if you go to museums to go to an exhibition on Zoroastrianism, one thing that's frequently included in a museum exhibition on Zoroastrians is any handwritten text which relates to the Zoroastrian tradition. And that's one way of understanding, manuscript meaning handwritten, Zoroastrian meaning something related to Zoroastrianism. So sometimes one goes to a museum and visits an exhibition on Zoroastrianism, in which there are many manuscripts that are displayed, which indeed relate to the Zoroastrian tradition, but which Zoroastrians never produced, which Zoroastrians never owned, and until very recent times, Zoroastrians never saw. So here's one example of a work of art that has been included in certain catalogs on Zoroastrianism. It's an illustration from one of the most famous manuscripts of Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, from the Safavid period. This is the court of the first king, the first man, Kiumars, in this absolutely stunning rendition of sort of explosion of natural beauty that existed in the time of Kiumars. It's a manuscript that today has been dispersed across many libraries and museums around the world. This particular page of the manuscript can be found in Toronto at the Aga Khan Museum. It was likely produced by a Safavid court painter by the name of Sultan Muhammad in the third decade of the 16th century. So that's one kind of Zoroastrian manuscript. But when most scholars talk about Zoroastrian manuscripts and the Zoroastrian manuscript tradition, they mean something else. That is to say, a handwritten text, not just about the Zoroastrian tradition, but one which was written by, or written for, or owned by a Zoroastrian. So when we think about this kind of Zoroastrian manuscript, I think the first thing that pops into most people's minds is a manuscript of the Avesta, the sacred books, the sacred scriptures, the liturgies of the Zoroastrian tradition. Various manuscripts of different Avestan texts exist in hundreds, perhaps in thousands of exemplars across the world. Pictured here is a particularly beautiful manuscript of the Vandidad, the Videvdad, again produced in Iran during the 17th century, in which at the beginning of each chapter there is an illustration of animals or of vegetation, which serves a kind of decorative function throughout the manuscript. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit more specific, or it's another way of saying this sort of second definition of Zoroastrian manuscript, which is to say a handwritten text that it belongs to a kind of a shared tradition, a manuscript tradition of copying, collecting, and use by Zoroastrian communities in central Iran, meaning Yazd and Kerman, and western South Asia, meaning Sindh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, in particular the area around Gujarat for most of the period I'm going to be talking. We know that even in pre-modern times, there existed a pre-modern tradition of collecting manuscripts among Zoroastrians. In a letter written exchanged from India to Kerman in central Iran, we read that when the Kermani Zoroastrians respond to their Indian compatriots about certain religious questions, that they also send them manuscripts because they have certain texts from the Zoroastrian tradition in Iran that they don't have in India. And so they think that in order to help their Indian brethren understand the tradition better, that they need to send them books. So the letter reads, "From the city of Kerman, the abode of security, we send the manuscripts of the Vishtasvyasht, that is the liturgy of Vishtas, and the liturgy of all models, that is the Vispared, for those of that quarter, so that the priests and those of that priestly class of that quarter might make copies of them." So we're not just sending a book, but we're expecting you also to copy these books by hand. We also write to say that if need be, a duplicate copy can be sent. In case you in India have duplicates of some of your books, you may send them for this congregation so that you will lay us under obligation, and all the Beit Dins will participate in the reward and the recompense. And this is a Persian letter, as anyone who knows Iran or who knows the Persian language would know. Persian is a very poetic language, and even Zoroastrians writing about borrowing books or sending books to India include poetry in their letters. Right? With every breath, I pray that we should meet, putting an end to this anxiety, this division and separation. A tale of such longing cannot be contained in 100 volumes. How can a description of my yearning be contained in a single letter? This, reflects a community that has been, separated by centuries, by sea, by geography, by politics, and yet which is coming together in participating in a shared culture of manuscript production and phrasing that sort of yearning for unity in these terms, in terms of a lover longing for their beloved. So let's talk about what Zoroastrian manuscripts look like. I know today's workshop is called From Scroll to Screen. We actually don't have very many Zoroastrian scrolls, but I'm going to try to get some scrolls in here just to make that title worthwhile. But the main form of Zoroastrian manuscripts is what scholars call the codex. And the codex is one way of making a book. It's the one that we're probably most familiar with. Right? It's books that look like this. That is a book that is bound in the center, which opens and lays flat, and which has pages that one can turn so that one can see text that is written on the front of the page and text that is written on the back of the page. Right? In other words, a standard format for Western books as well. Pictured here is a particularly beautiful example of a binding of a Zoroastrian codex in stamped Morocco leather. This is a luxurious Zoroastrian manuscript that was produced in Navsari in the later part of the 18th century. There are other kinds of Zoroastrian manuscripts, though, besides these books, these codices, as we call them. One form of manuscript that I'm particularly interested, that my students are particularly interested, are what we call documents. When we talk about documents, we mean something else. This is a handwritten text, indeed, but one which exists generally on a single folio of paper. Pictured here is a document from Navsari, where I worked, part of a much larger collection of documents there. This is the imperial farman of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, granted, talking about the land which had been granted to Meher Jirana, the famous priest from Navsari, and here highlighting that Jagir that Akbar had granted to Meher Jirana will be maintained for his son Kekobad. Right, so this is a different kind of manuscript in that it's not bound. Right? It's a separate, sort of folio, a separate sheet of paper. You can see kind of from the photograph, if you look closely, that this was originally sort of folded up in a very sort of tight pattern, so that in its original form, it would have sort of resembled just a small thing that you could hold in your hand, which was then stamped with the imperial seal. We know from the Mughal period that actually when such imperial documents were granted by the king to their subjects, it was frequently the case that these documents would be placed in the turban of the person whom they were granted to. So we can sort of imagine Kekobad, son of Meher Jirana, as having once, perhaps had this farman, as it was sort of tightly wrapped up in his turban. Zoroastrian manuscripts today are kept in collections around the world. And I was trying to just think about the scale of the Zoroastrian manuscript tradition and where it resides today. So I don't necessarily guarantee that this slide is 100% accurate, but I was just trying to think of all the libraries around the world in which you can find manuscripts that were once copied by, copied for, or owned by Zoroastrians. And I tried to organize it in terms of the number of manuscripts that could be found in each of these libraries. I excluded private collections, and I excluded collections that only had a single manuscript, because I needed to be able to fit them all on one slide. But this is sort of what it looks like. The largest collection of Zoroastrian manuscripts today is in Bombay at the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute. It's difficult to say exactly how many manuscripts are there. I think it's undoubtedly greater than 1,000. And we could talk about how one sort of arrives at these estimates later. The next largest collections of Zoroastrian manuscripts, to the best of my knowledge, are the Meher Jirana Library in Navsari, which is somewhere in the vicinity of 700 manuscripts, plus another 500 historical documents and copies. And it's the main library for documents, if that's what you're interested in. And the British Library in London, which incorporated the older India Office Library and has also more than 100 manuscripts. And you can sort of follow the list on down. Some very large collections in Iran, which have greater than 50 manuscripts. Many libraries around India, as well as libraries in Europe and North America, have greater than 10 manuscripts. Libraries like Houston here have more than one manuscript, have a few manuscripts, and therefore also figure into this sort of breakdown. But when one sort of adds all this up, the numbers are difficult to calculate because we actually don't know how vast these collections are. My suspicion, after having worked on Zoroastrian manuscripts for the last 25 years, is that there are likely more than 10,000, if not, somewhere in that order of magnitude, the order of magnitude of the 10,000 total Zoroastrian manuscripts which survive. That's quite a lot, actually, for a small religious community like the Zoroastrians. It's quite remarkable. The Zoroastrians were a very literate and literary community. Part of the history of these collections is, of course, intrinsically tied to the history of colonialism. Right? You will have noted that many European libraries figure quite prominently on that list of collections of Zoroastrian manuscripts, the British Library, more than any other. And that is because European libraries have collected Zoroastrian manuscripts for a very long time. Right? There were already Zoroastrian manuscripts in Europe in the 1600s. Right? There was a wealthy Parsi in the city of Surat by the name of Nanabai Punjia, who, for instance, had a copy of the Yasna, the Zoroastrian liturgy, copied out, and who dedicated that manuscript to Emmanuel College in Cambridge in the late 1600s. So that's quite remarkable, actually. We also, know that European scholars at the beginning of the 1700s were already writing to their connections in the East India Company in Britain and then the corresponding East India Companies of other colonial states, that they wanted them to acquire Zoroastrian manuscripts for their growing collections. Here's a letter from Thomas Hyde, which is quite unpleasant to read. When any ship is bound for Surat, I desire to know it. The same request I have at Surat, to get the old Parsis' vocabulary by which they teach their children. But they, being very close and not apt to impart anything, this must be done by a little bribing of one of their priests with a little money, and telling him it's for me, who is a great lover of their religion. So, I mean, already there's a notion that these manuscripts are being acquired, in both legal and semi-legal means. The library that I worked the longest at, as I think many people know here, is a library in Navsari. I lived in Navsari for quite an amount of time, from 6 months in 2008, 4 months in 2009. It amounts to more than a year spent there. It's one of my favorite photos of that library because it's all decked out in light. This is the first Dustur Mejirana library in Navsari, which is the oldest still standing Zoroastrian library in India. It was established in 1872. I say it's the oldest still standing library in India because it's not the oldest Zoroastrian library in India by any means. In fact, the Mullah Firuz Library, which had been in Bombay, was established as a separate institution in 1857, right after the Indian Revolution. Eventually, the collections of the Mullah Firuz Library were incorporated into the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute, which, as I've already said, is the largest Zoroastrian collection of Zoroastrian manuscripts anywhere in the world. To give you some sense of how large the collections of the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute are, here are the 6 catalogs that have been printed of the K.R. Kama's collections. As I said, the first catalogs were those of the Mullah Firuz collection, but since that collection now resides in the Kama, I'm including those here. And even these 6 catalogs is only a very small fraction of what actually resides in the Kama. So there is indeed quite an enormous amount of material that is here. In addition to all of these manuscripts I've already talked about, there are also manuscripts which reside in private collections. Pictured here are 2 catalogs of, on the left, an individual private collection, that of Dasturji Jamas Pasa. This was that of the current Dasturji Jamas Pasa's grandfather, Manchurji Jamasji Jamas Pasana. On the right is a catalog of many different private collections that was surveyed in 1941 by Jamshedji Katrak, and he counted more than 1,000 manuscripts in his time residing in private collections. Part of the job of a modern scholar of Zoroastrian manuscripts is, in fact, to try to trace where all of these manuscripts have gone since the time that they were cataloged. Many of the private collections that existed in Katrak's time no longer exist in the same form that they did in Katrak's time. It's likely that some of them were donated to various libraries. It's likely that some of them were sold into other private collections. Some of them were inherited. But part of the challenge of working with Zoroastrian manuscripts is often simply to find where a manuscript that a scholar of 50 or 100 years ago had worked with, because it may very well not be in the same place where it was 50 or 100 years ago. So I want to talk first, as we get into the meat of the talk, about some of the different ideas that people have about Zoroastrian manuscripts, and then I want to talk about what we do when we study manuscripts, what these manuscripts can tell us. So I want to talk about a couple of myths. The first myth, I think, is a myth of ancientness, a myth of antiquity, which is to say that many people, when they imagine a Zoroastrian manuscript, believe that Zoroastrian manuscripts are necessarily ancient, right? And this sort of depends on what you mean by ancient. I mean, my daughter thinks I'm ancient, for instance. I'm not as ancient as most Zoroastrian manuscripts. But I think when the term ancient and antiquity are used in American universities, at least, what is usually meant is sort of, the time of the classics, the time of Greece and Rome. And indeed, there aren't any surviving Zoroastrian manuscripts that are quite as old as ancient Greece, unless you count imperial inscriptions and a couple of sort of fragments in Aramaic that are related to Persian kingship, but are not part of the same Zoroastrian manuscript tradition. The oldest surviving Zoroastrian manuscripts, one has to sort of be a little liberal with how one defines this. According to some definitions of a Zoroastrian manuscript, what's pictured here may be sort of included as a Zoroastrian manuscript in that it includes the Sogdian version of the sacred Hashem Vahu prayer at the beginning of the text. However, this is probably being quoted by a Manichaean, not by a Zoroastrian, so it doesn't sort of necessarily fulfill the sort of component of this being something that was actually written by a Zoroastrian. At any rate, this is the first written evidence of the Avestan language from the 9th century of the Common Era, right? So it's a little more than 1,200 years old, we would think. It was found in Dunhuang and Western China, so it's not really part of that same Zoroastrian manuscript tradition that I've been talking about, because though there were likely to have been ancient Zoroastrians in Dunhuang, that was not a community which survived for long enough to develop a manuscript tradition that could come into contact with those in Iran and India. The first written evidence for what we call the Pahlavi language in what we call the book Pahlavi script, this is the way in which Zoroastrians write Middle Persian in manuscripts, also comes from Central Asia, actually. Pictured here is one folio. I put both sides of the folio from the Museum for Anthropology in Berlin, found in the Turfan Oasis, dating from the 9th or the 10th centuries. But if we think about what I'm calling the Zoroastrian manuscript tradition, then our first manuscripts are from even later than these. Right? Our earliest manuscript, according to this understanding, is pictured here. This is a manuscript of the Vispered, the Avestan liturgy that's found in the Royal Library of Copenhagen today, what they call manuscript K7b. What I pictured here is something that we as scholars of manuscripts are very interested in, and that's what we call the colophon. Right? A colophon is that part of the manuscript, sort of like the about the author page of a book or the copyright page of a book, in which the person who wrote the manuscript gives us some information about how they came to write the manuscript, where they wrote the manuscript, when they wrote the manuscript, who they are, for what reason they wrote the manuscript, and so on. And this is what that colophon says in Pahlavi. Completed in health, joy, and peace on the day Osman and in the month Spandarmad in the intercalary Persian year 637. There's actually some debate as to whether this manuscript is using what we know to be the Yazdagirdi calendar, the same calendar that Parsis today continue to use, or whether it's using what we call the Yazdagirdi plus 20 calendar. So for that reason, scholars are unsure whether it was written in 1268 of the Common Era or 1288 of the Common Era. This is a manuscript then it's pretty old for sure, especially as Zoroastrian manuscripts go. But it is not, among the most ancient manuscripts that survive from, many other cultures. It was written in the land of India, in the city of Ankleshwar, written by Rostam, son of Mehraban, son of Mazban, son of Daniel. Right? So we can recognize these names, we can recognize the place now as being places in which we know, the Parsi community historically to have developed. And we can also trace ways in which manuscripts like this one from the 13th century are connected to manuscripts that are copied much later, manuscripts of the 18th, even the 19th and 20th centuries, through a kind of direct connection through Zoroastrian manuscript tradition. And so just for some context, 1268 is 10 years after the Mongols have sacked the city of Baghdad, right? So it's a time of considerable change in the Middle East. It's also a time of considerable change in India and in Gujarat as the Gujarat Sultanate begins to develop away from the Delhi Sultanate and lays the groundwork for what is to come later. But the vast majority of our Zoroastrian manuscripts are from much, much later than these periods, right? 13th, 14th, 15th century manuscripts are very rare among those 10,000s of Zoroastrian manuscripts which survive. The majority of what we have that survives comes from the 17 and 1800s, that is the 18th and the 19th century. The most prolific scribe that I'm aware of anyone, any person within the Zoroastrian manuscript tradition who copied manuscripts is this guy. I think he should be much better known than he is. This is Erechji Sorabji Merjirana, who lived from 1826 to 1900. He's a remarkable scribe. He was for many years the librarian of the Mullah Firuz Library in Bombay. And while he was there, he would be given manuscripts to catalog, as librarians still are, but he had the practice of making 3 copies of every manuscript that he was given to catalog by hand. Right? So he's responsible actually for preserving an enormous amount of the Zoroastrian tradition that otherwise would likely not have been preserved. His personal manuscript collection became the basis of the Merjirana Library in Navsari, which means that much of what's in the Merjirana Library is a duplicate of what's in the Kara-Kama Oriental Institute, because he was literally writing manuscripts from both libraries. Many of his manuscripts also were purchased by a patron of his by the name of Sorabji Burgerji Ashburner, whose manuscripts were eventually given to the British Library. So many of his manuscripts are there as well. He's remarkable, though, because he copied manuscripts for like a super long period of time. There's a manuscript in Navsari of his that was written in 1208 Yazdagirdi, which is 1839 of the Common Era. If anyone's paying close attention, he was born in 1826, which means that he was 12 when he copied this manuscript, 12 years old. It's a manuscript of school texts, the kinds of texts that a Parsi was learning in school in the 1830s. Including this text, which is a series of questions and answers between a Zoroastrian teacher and a Zoroastrian pupil about the nature of the Zoroastrian religion. Very interestingly, Merjirana went back to this manuscript much later in his life and wrote a little apology on the manuscript for his bad handwriting, because he says, I wrote this manuscript when I was a little kid, and therefore I have poor handwriting, please forgive me. So it's very sweet. It's the kind of thing that, as a scholar of manuscripts, I love to find, because it shows just the human element in the production of these texts. Okay, myth number 2, Zoroastrian manuscripts are intrinsically rarer than printed texts. This seems like it should make sense, right? A manuscript has to be copied out by hand, a printed text can be copied in the thousands or hundreds. And yet, in terms of what is actually preserved in the archive, there are many examples of printed texts which have become quite rare. The community and scholars have privileged manuscripts to such an extent that other things that perhaps should have been collected that are of interest to historians, to scholars of Zoroastrianism, are not collected. Pictured here, for instance, is a lithographed Persian yasna, of which I'm only familiar with one surviving example anywhere in the world. It's an absolutely sort of unique look into in Irani take on the performance of the yasna ritual, printed in 1893. But among many other things that are very rare in the Zoroastrian archive are things like newspapers, right? It's actually far more difficult to find a newspaper from the 19th century than it is to find a manuscript of the Avesta, for instance, because libraries simply did not collect newspapers. We know that they existed in circulations of thousands for big papers like the Mumbai Samachar, or circulations of hundreds for smaller papers like the Chabuk or the Durbin. And yet virtually none of these newspapers from the 19th century survive to the present day. Right? So I find, when we go into the archive and find a collection of old newspapers, or even of newspaper clippings that this is, truly a remarkable thing, because these are some of the rarest sources out there for the study of the history of Zoroastrianism. Other things like this is one of the earliest examples of printed book illustration from the Zoroastrian community in the 1840s. I'm only aware of one surviving copy of this book, a translation of Shahnameh, translated by Fargunji Marzbanji, the famous pioneer of the Indian press. Right, so some printed books are indeed as valuable or more valuable than manuscripts. There are even manuscripts which are copied from printed books, because even in the time that the manuscript was copied, the printed book was quite rare. So someone decided that rather than reprint the printed book, they would merely copy it by hand. Right? And so one actually frequently goes into a library looking for a manuscript of the text, only to realize that the text that one is reading is actually copied from the printed book. Myth number 3, Zoroastrian manuscripts are written in ancient languages. This is true, of course, that some Zoroastrian manuscripts are written in languages like Avestan and Pahlavi. But even though scholars have given more attention to those manuscripts which are written in ancient languages like Avestan and Pahlavi, many Zoroastrian manuscripts are actually written in languages that people still speak, right? And there was never a period of time in which someone wrote a manuscript who didn't speak either Persian or Gujarati, right? Because our earliest manuscripts are really from the 13th century. This is a time in which any learned person, any learned Zoroastrian priest in Iran knew Persian. It was a time in which any learned priest in India probably also knew Persian and also knew maybe some Sanskrit and also some Gujarati. So many of our Zoroastrian manuscripts are in fact in languages like Persian, that is the same Persian that's still spoken and written in Iran today, and are written in languages like Gujarati, which is not all that different from the Gujarati that everyone speaks here, right? I know that this looks like it might be written in Devanagari script, but this is a diagram of a dakhma, and if one looks at it very closely, one realizes that you can just sort of take off that top line, and then you have sort of normal Gujarati. We'll look at some Gujarati texts later in the presentation in a few minutes. Myth number 4, Zoroastrian manuscripts are only about religion. By my definition of Zoroastrian manuscript, the Zoroastrian manuscript being anything copied by or for or about or owned, sorry, anything by, for, or owned by a Zoroastrian. There are all kinds of manuscripts that are not obviously connected to the Zoroastrian religion. Some of them might be connected to other religions because Zoroastrians were interested in other religions in the medieval period. Here's the kind of thing that I always am, really interested to find in the archive. This is a cookbook in Persian. In fact, it's called the Khulasatul Makulat wa Mashrubat, sort of the essence of things you can eat and things you can drink. It turns out that it's a copy of the Imperial Mughal cookbook. This was the cookbook that had belonged to Shah Jahan, so it has all these Mughlai dishes in it. But this was a copy of that cookbook that was made by a Muslim scribe, Abdullah bin Sayyid Nurullah Qadri, but it was made for a Parsi patron. Everyone knows Parsis love food, and this guy, Hormazji Bhikaji Meherji, sorry, Khorsaji Hormazji, was no different, and had this amazing cookbook of all sorts of Mughlai delicacies prepared for him in the later part of the 19th century. Okay, so those are some myths about manuscripts. Why do people study manuscripts in the first place? Right? Why should someone be interested in these old, dusty, holy, worm-eaten, sometimes books? Well, one reason, that many scholars like myself are traditionally interested in manuscripts is that we are interested in texts. We're interested in the text that these manuscripts contain. We're interested in editing and translating those texts. So, for instance, I first started working on manuscripts largely as a result of my dissertation. As was said in my introduction, my dissertation was basically on stories of the life of Prophet Zarathustra, and I was interested in particular in a book that's called the Zaratoshnameh, the Book of Zarathustra, which is in Persian, as you can see here. And so something I would do, as a doctoral student, would be to collect many different manuscripts of this text, like this one and this one, not in as good condition, obviously. And this one, it's still in Persian, but they transcribed it all in Gujarati script, and then they gave a Gujarati translation to it. And then I would study all of those manuscripts and try to figure out how they related to each other and how they related to the original text that had been composed by the author. Right? So this is the kind of thing that scholars do. We try to make sort of trees of these manuscripts and try to get back to a kind of originary, manuscript. Uh, and then we produce an edition of the text, that's much cleaner, perhaps, than manuscripts. All the little differences in the manuscripts are contained in the footnotes, and you can see that in my dissertation. I don't know, I had 41, different manuscript variations on the first page of my edition of the text. Right? And these can tell us, things about how people interpreted different passages of the text differently. People, made little notes on the text. Certain lines of the text were incomprehensible in later periods, and they decided to rewrite them. All sorts of things can be sort of discovered through manuscript variations. And one very striking example that was pointed out by Alberto Cantera and Miguel Angel Andrés Toledo many years ago, even Avestan language texts and their commentaries were significantly edited over time for different priestly groups who had different interests in reading those texts. Pictured here is a passage from the Videvdod. You can see I've marked in red here and in blue here 2 words, which have many words between them on the left. In the version that was made during the 18th century of this text by Dr. Dorob and his followers, all those words between the red and the blue were deleted. And there are many manuscripts following Dr. Dorob's redacted Videvdod, which have omitted those words in many different passages in the Videvdod. These are just words in the commentary. They don't really have much sort of theological significance. Dr. Dorob saw them as being unnecessary explanations for many of the passages which he included. Scholars like Carl Friedrich Geldner, when he was editing the Avesta, this has become the basis of modern scholarly treatments of the Avestan language and also of Zoroastrian priestly versions of Avestan, note all of their different manuscript variations down there in those footnotes. And you can just see how many different manuscripts there are and how dense those footnotes are, right? This is a very involved and time-consuming task indeed. Today, the sort of modern successor to Geldner is the Corpus Avesticum project at the University of Berlin, run by Alberto Cantera and his team, which is a much more comprehensive survey of Zoroastrian manuscripts, Avestan manuscripts that survive today. Houston's own manuscripts can be found there, and they contribute, to this sort of greater understanding of the great amount of textual variation that can be found in the Avesta. In particular, one of the things that Alberto noted is that much of the variation in manuscripts has to do with the different ways in which Avesta manuscripts were used in ritual contexts. Right, one yasna might be performed in one kshnuman at a certain time of day, another manuscript might be performed in a different kshnuman. So what he's tried to do is to recreate all of the different variations in ritual that could occur, and then create something that could generate what that ritual looks like on his website. Okay, so that's one use of manuscripts from a scholarly perspective. Some of you might have seen the talk I gave online and at the University of London, the School for Oriental and African Studies last year, which has to do with the art of the Zoroastrian book. The Zoroastrian books don't just contain texts, they often contain art as well. I'll just quickly run through one text that survives in many illustrated editions. Many of you guys know the story of Ardavirov, the man who saw visions of heaven and hell. Turns out that the story of Ardavirov in the Persian and Gujarati versions is very, very frequently illustrated in manuscripts. So we have, for instance, an illustrated manuscript of the Ardavirov Name at Princeton, which you can see here. Apparently dated from the 16th century, 1589. There are many of them. Here's one in the Kama Institute. Just run through them quickly. Another one in the Kama Institute. Here's one from the National Museum of India in Delhi. One from John Ryland's library in Manchester. Here's a very ornate one from the Salar Jung Museum in Hyderabad. Sort of a special case, but I don't have time to go into that. There are also Gujarati language illustrated manuscripts of Ardavirov Namu. So if you go to MS University in Baroda, they have on display in their libraries sort of display case, an illustrated manuscript of Ardavirov Namu in Gujarati. Here you can see, the weighing of the good deeds and bad deeds in the Chinwad pool that the soul crosses over after death. There's some more illustrations of that. This one from Paris, from another manuscript in Paris. This one from a friend in Bombay, a private collection belonging to Homi Khusro Khan. And some of you, I'm sure, know. This one now belonging to Zar Amrolia in London. It had previously been in Phoenix, Arizona, but it's now been restored by Zar in London. And another in Munich, and several others in different private collections. When you study, these illustrated manuscripts, you can sort of get an idea of like what the artist's process was, right? I mean, how is it that all of these manuscripts have the same illustrations? What did the process of the Zoroastrian artist or the artists employed by Zoroastrians look like? One of the unique things about our manuscript in Princeton is that it has inserted in it templates for the artist to follow. I think that's what they are anyway. The pages that don't have any text on them that are then, sort of copied and interpreted by the artist in various places, right? So on the right, the template, on the left, the image that actually is bound in the manuscript. So perhaps there were workshops in which templates of different scenes circulated and the artist was meant to copy those scenes. You can also sort of see on some of the folios of this manuscript in Paris, traces of pencil drawings under the painting, right? So of course you can see the painting on top, but if you look up here, you can also see some traces of perhaps what had been the original sketching out of the painting. Or another example here, in which, again, the figures are placed slightly differently, and because of that, you can still see the sort of traces of them, right? And you can see, for instance, the scales were originally slightly to the left and right of where they currently are. The human figures also who are meeting Meherizad are also placed lower than where their sketches were originally drawn to have been. One final example that I'll run through here, the artist must have had the wrong scene in mind because he drew a chariot being drawn by horses, which is actually not this scene at all. It's another scene. So you can see the chariot and the horses here, but that's, I didn't even show it. It's actually the chariot of the sun that's on another page. I'll skip that for now. Okay, I'm going to come to the end of my presentation by talking about the thing that I'm most interested in the study of manuscripts, which is the intersection between manuscripts and social history. This is one of my favorite illustrations that I found over the years looking in Zoroastrian manuscripts, which is a painting indeed, but it's not a narrative painting. It's a portrait of a kind in which the figure on the left, you can read in Gujarati, is identified as Pestanji Kuvarji Ranaji Pote. So Pestanji Kuvarji Ranaji himself. There's a figure on the other side of the manuscript who's not identified. We know that this Pestanji Kuvarji Ranji was the person who had commissioned the manuscript to be written. And apparently, as the manuscript was written by the scribes, they also decided to include a painting of their patron. A number of manuscripts today that are available for a broader study beyond the manuscripts which are in the Avestan Digital Archive that Alberto has set up, have been digitized and preserved by my colleague Alma Hinsa and her team at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London as part of their multimedia Yasna project. If you guys haven't seen the multimedia Yasna project, it is really wonderful. I highly recommend everyone to go and watch the annotated video of the performance of the Yasna that Alma has put there. But another aspect of her project has been what's called the Zoroastrian Manuscripts Repository, which, as the description tells us, has digitized and provided access to manuscripts from the Kama Tornan Institute in Bombay and the Mirza Institute, the Mirza Library in Udwara, as well as other collections. And some of the manuscripts there are really fascinating for the study of social history. Pictured here is yet another Avestan manuscript from the Kama Tornan Institute of Devdad from the early 1800s. But if you read the colophon, you can see the colophon there in Gujarati, and I'll give it to you in good Gujarati, like easy readable Gujarati here. I think many people here understand Gujarati, so I can just read it out. Sapaso Shokr Dada Hormazna ne Bhali Maziasni Din Zartost Spantaman Anoshe Rawana Shukrana E Kitab Vandidad Nietzsche. Te Potana Ruan Nevaste, Tata Potana Nek Sawab Nevaste, Daremerma Anjuman Nakam Nevaste, Potana Nek Dam Karchine Rajukido, Tata Bakshioche. Te Kamtarin Khaksar, Bhalu Mazdiasni Dina, Behetin Sri Panch Bai Asibai, Te Parsi Bamanji, Ben Dhadubai, Ben Homani, Dhaniani, Te Asal Morena Revasi Daruwala, E Potana Sawabna, Ham Berana Vaste, Tata Potana Garib Mobad, Ashodad Apiuche. Why is that interesting? Well, what? No, it's your language, so you know. But why is that interesting? It's interesting, I think, because this is someone whose name is Bai Asibai, and she's someone's Dania. What does that mean? She's a wife, right? She's a woman, in other words. We have so little evidence for Zoroastrian women in the pre-modern period, and one of the places where we can find them is in Zoroastrian manuscripts and in these kinds of colophons. This is a manuscript that was commissioned by a woman for her late husband's mobed, which she's given this manuscript. She's given this manuscript to him as Ashodad. We can also find women in surviving Parthi documents. Here's a letter written from a son to his mom, sometime around 1600. Also in Gujarati, there's a letter of Noshirvan to his mother Dhanai. I won't read the whole thing. Good health to our revered mother Dhanai and Nosari and everyone else. Noshirvan sends many greetings. Things here are well. Write with your news. Diara Rustam has written a letter in which it was written that my sister's wedding has taken place. Bravo! Right? Obviously, Parsis back then were very concerned, as many are today, about family members getting married and fixing rishtas and this kind of thing. You get this, sort of interesting view of a Zoroastrian not talking about these kinds of lofty things, the performance of a yasna or whatever, but trying to figure out how to run his business, maintain his family through this letter to his wife, his letter to his mother. And you can see, right to say whether the children are happy. You never read about children, Zoroastrian children in most ancient texts, and yet here, that's something that they're, talking about. Are the chokra ramta? That's cool. Remember us to buy Chandni, Makai, and Hansiai. Maybe those are the servants. Write letters with your news if you know anyone coming this way. Remember us to our revered aunt Jasi, our revered aunt Shazan, our revered aunt Hira, our revered aunt Melan. Interesting names. So, okay, I'm going to close just with something that we've been thinking about at Princeton. I have a number of students who work on manuscripts and colophons and documents, and we've been trying to think about big projects that we could do which relate to the manuscripts. As you can see, the problem of Zoroastrian manuscripts is actually enormous. We're talking about something that's on the scale of the thousands or 10,000s. I mean, even that which is available to us is basically in the scale of the many hundreds or thousands. It's a scale in which no single person can sort of do it all. Even if you learn Avestan and Pali and Sanskrit and Persian and Gujarati and Marathi and all the different languages that Zoroastrian texts can occur in, there's no way that any single person could possibly have in their minds the full breadth of Zoroastrian literature. So, we're thinking about kind of meta projects, that is making catalogs of all the catalogs that exist, right? I showed you guys 50 different collections in which Zoroastrian manuscripts currently exist. We need an index of all of those libraries' catalogs just to be able to navigate them. And there's been so much press about artificial intelligence, and as a college teacher, I am intimately aware of all of the horrible ways in which artificial intelligence can be used in a college classroom. But one thing that artificial intelligence has the potential to do, it's not been realized, and I'm not going to say that that I have the answers to this yet, is to very quickly amalgamate big data. That is, it's designed to read large quantities of text quickly and digest them in a way that can be processed. So just as a little demonstration, I made a video. I said, attached is a publication of historical Parsi documents belonging to the Anjuman Nosari. produce as a spreadsheet an index of all the names which occur in those documents, and then do some stuff in the different columns. And so this is what Google Gemini did when I did it. It's by no means perfect. It has all sorts of errors that it, sort of unpredictably throws into it. But anyway, you see the video playing. This was a collection of 500 documents, and within I cut the video a little bit. Within 3 minutes, it had generated some sort of beginnings of an index of all the different names that occur in these documents. I wanted it to give me the document numbers, the names occurring. Didn't know way to do that. But here's what that looks like as a Google sheet. So, I mean, I think we're at an exciting moment in which there is actually real possibility of using some of these tools that are out there, hopefully in more educated and informed ways than simply, typing a request into Google or ChatGPT. But I want to leave it with that. We're at a very exciting moment in the field of Zoroastrian studies because there are all kinds of new questions that we can now ask of the sources that we have. And we're just, at this exciting point in which we're starting to find some of those answers. Thank you very much for your attention. I know I've gone a little long, but I look forward to your questions. So.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Let me just make sure. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I just wanted to say we're going to take maybe 1 to 2 questions right now because lunch will be served soon, and then we'll continue with more questions for Daniel after Dr. Marachi's talk. Okay, so take it away. I will pass the mic around.
Thank you so much for such deep understanding of manuscripts. I had one question which has plagued me for a long time. Is we have, I don't know what it's called, a manuscript or what, but there is a very old document in here which refers to the collection after the destruction of the Zoroastrian temples in Iran. It refers to somebody who's picking those pieces up of destruction and putting it together as a book.
Right.
And it is incredibly detailed. What surprised me is how detailed it is in terms of collecting how Zoroastrians came together, including laws regarding the adaptation of slaves. So my question is there anything like that existing somewhere else? Because you cannot find a reference.
So, I mean, what that immediately brings to mind is the colophon of Denkard, this Middle Persian book that was compiled in the 9th century. Basically, the way in which they talk about the compilation of this great Zoroastrian encyclopedia in the 9th century is as though they are gleaning like a glimmer of a spark of a flame of an original light, right? So there's this metaphor that there had once existed like a bright light, a bright fire that has somehow been destroyed, and presumably what is intended here is in the first instance the Arab conquest of Iran, but also the sort of process where earlier compilations, even in the Islamic period, had been destroyed or lost, and that they basically have this metaphor where writing a book is seen as being something akin to consecrating a fire temple, that is rekindling an old spark. And so that's what that immediately calls to mind. I'd have to see exactly what the document you're talking about is. I mean, there are other much later books from the 19th century which seek to document archaeological sites in Iran. There's a book in Persian which is commissioned by a Parsi called Asar-e-Ajam, which also talks about how Iran, which was once the mark of paradise, has become ruined in our time, and therefore it's incumbent on us to travel around, find all the vestiges of the past, document them. It's an illustrated book. Maybe it could be that you're talking about. I'm not exactly sure. So yeah.
The reason I'm asking that is I I think Perplexity is far more detailed than Gemini to
Right.
give you an answer. And it basically says no.
Right.
It rarely says no on anything, but it says no on this. But that reference exists in this library here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the different AI models have different strengths. One of the strengths of Gemini has to do with the fact that it's built on Google's Google Book Project, which scanned an enormous amount of books in libraries. It was scanned at Harvard the entire time I was there. They just have access to a much greater amount of historical publications than the other AI models do. It's not as sophisticated and doing lots of things, but one thing that it's very good at is relying on big text models, and especially on different languages like Gujarati and Persian. So yeah.
One more question. Raise your hand. No? Okay.
I was looking at the illustrations you were showing us, and I was wondering if the scholars have given a translation to those illustrations as well. Like when we see some of them without any shoes on the feet, does that mean those people are dead?
Right. Yes. So the short answer is that the illustrations illustrate the story of Adavirov. There's a good, reliable English translation of the Adavirov Nomad from Middle Persian, from Pahlavi. These are slightly different versions of the story. So both in Persian and in Gujarati, they've expanded considerably what there is in Pahlavi. They're also in verse, so it's a poetic text. There is not really an English translation of the verse Adavirov Nome or of the Gujarati Adavirov Nome. They've both been edited, so there's a good Persian edition and a good Gujarati edition of the texts. But in fact, other than little bits that I have just in my book, there's really nothing that's been translated of these texts. They're quite easy to read, though. So I mean, if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to read them for you. What was your question about the dead here? Was it? Yes. Right. Right. So correct. So right. So for instance, here, of course, it's an interesting question from a Zoroastrian perspective, because Zoroastrians are sort of enjoined religiously to wear shoes. Indeed, the Ardavirov is in the back in these images. He's the beardless figure in the back looking over the hill. And he's looking at three souls of the departed here. The reason why he's beardless is that he's also sort of entered into this like state of being a soul, and when one enters the state of being a soul, then one is instantly reverted to being a 15-year-old. So they're always depicted as youthful. These figures, I think, aren't wearing shoes because they're sitting on carpets. I think that's the main reason why they're not wearing shoes. The figures in hell who are completely naked, as I'm sure you noticed, are of course not wearing shoes, but they're not wearing anything else either. But yeah, they're definitely dead. So those are the souls being tormented for their sins. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Right now, we're going to have some lunch, enjoy that, and then we'll continue at 1 p.m. with Dr. Marashi's talk. And then any other questions you have for Dr. Sheffield and Dr. Marashi, will address them after, okay? We'll be back at 1 p.m. sharp. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.